Battle of Yorktown, Virginia, which led George Washington to victory and basically the independence of the United States, may be a strange place to begin. We're talking about a Romanian peasant uprising, which revolted against a Hungarian aristocracy living under the Holy Roman Empire, German-speaking, mostly. But bear with me. By the end of this video, I'm Benjamin. Let me know what your name is. I want you to see that this ethnic Romanian uprising was really part of what was happening in the American Revolution and the French Revolution and in other parts of Europe, as the ideas of the Enlightenment were beginning to change how people saw themselves and the concept of the nation-state that had arisen in the century prior, with the Peace of Westphalia painted here. And this in Romania, the Enlightenment, not the Peace of Westphalia, expressed itself in three men chiefly who led a bloody uprising. Horea, mainly, Crișan and Cloșca, though it expressed itself very differently to the revolutions further west. Holy Roman Emperor Joseph II, like his contemporary Catherine the Great and Napoleon, was what German historian Wilhelm Röscher coined as being an Enlightenment absolutist. But what does all this mean? First, we have to understand what the Enlightenment was, and then we have to understand the absolute monarchs, basically despots, who were ruling over peoples during this, and how they took up these ideas. And then we can understand how this collided with ethnic Romanians. For ages the world was ruled by the chain of being, the old way. You were born into place and you died into place. Kings sat on thrones by God's will, and men were bound to the soil. There was a chain of being. You were born a peasant, so you died a peasant. You were born amongst the petty nobility, and you died a petty nobleman. But by the 1600s a new idea arose. A new light which spread first through religious tolerance in German lands and the Netherlands, and then the economic mobility of corporations, forming in the Netherlands and then in England. Intellectual exchange was spread in encyclopedias and salons, and coffee houses where men were free to question the social order. In Scotland, thinkers like David Hume and Adam Smith began to weigh how wealth and trade truly work. Their fellow Scot, Robert Burns, did not just follow old lore, he used his wits to sculpt a new Scottish national identity. Across Europe, embryonic forms of national awakenings began to brew. In our universities, and then in our bureaucracies, science itself became a new religion, and men believed they can discover or reason into being a better world through breaking apart and rearranging materials. The Enlightenment was deeply materialistic, even nihilistic, in its scientific theories that often rejected men have any spiritual need at all. Later, the Romantics would rebel against this, but for the time being, these ideas, fusing religious tolerance, economic aspiration, and cultural patronage, spread to the American colonies in which Dutch, English, German, and Scottish settlers lived side by side, that allowed the American Revolution, under a canopy of Enlightenment ideas. Despite its scientific nihilism, the Enlightenment had good points too. Religious tolerance, for example. Across the sea, this light caught fire. The American Revolution wasn't just a fight over taxes. Folks stood up and said, "We will rule ourselves by laws founded in reason, not a king appointed by God." This contributed to the French Revolution, where priests were hunted down. There was an anti-theocratic sense in the age. The cost of the old world dying was blood and chaos in France, 5 years after Horea's revolt. Then Napoleon fused the Enlightenment spreading of reason and religious tolerance, along with natural rights given to men, with the absolute rule of a true monarch. And he was not alone. George Washington nearly became this kind of monarch, but he refused that title. And as I noted, Catherine the Great, she was of this model. She spread literacy in Russia. Gustav V of Sweden, who ushered in a revival of Swedish art and playwrights. Frederick the Great of Prussia, whose military feats were astounding, and he brought religious tolerance, as well as being a patron of art, music, architecture, and almost everything else you can think of. Otto, King of Greece. I just like how pompous his painting is. In the Holy Roman Empire, Joseph II, the enlightened despot, took the lead. He didn't want a bloodbath like France, which had not happened yet, but he did want a modern state. He looked at Jews and other outsiders and saw they could be useful for the realm. Through his toleration patent, he accepted Jews, not out of love, but out of the belief that all should serve the common weal, that he should rule over everyone, and they should serve him equally. Yet Joseph's hardest task lay in his Hungarian lands, chiefly Transylvania. He saw the serfs, the poor folk, tied to the land who were mostly ethnic Romanians, and wanted to break their chains. This was enlightenment from the top down, the benevolent overlord. He sought reforms to free ethnic Romanians. But the lords of the land hated the emperor's good deeds. When the Horea revolt broke out in 1784, the clash between the old feudal masters and this new style of enlightened king was in vogue. This was a fight between the emperor and the aristocracy. Sadly, it was the common people caught between who suffered. Later in his life, Joseph II was quoted as saying, "Everything for the people, nothing by the people," which incidentally led to a revolution in what is now Belgium. Maybe that's another video, but what it means essentially is that he has this birthright to decide what is good for the people, so long as he has these Enlightenment ideas. This was an ideology rooted in the foundations of liberalism. That meant you were enlightened, that you knew better than people who don't know how to read, but you wanted to appeal to them. You see where it's getting at? This was a form of proto-populism. Napoleon, of course, would perfect this. And this meant certain rulers of the time appealed to the people in order to lift them up in a way that would help these rulers politically to fight their own aristocracy. And it got out of hand a few times, mainly in France. That's another story. This revolt, what happened when the Holy Roman Emperor began to appeal to the Romanian peasants who were in opposition to the Hungarian aristocracy, who were a force between the peasants and the emperor. There were three main sides in this revolt, not two, as is the usual case. You had the rebels, of course, who wanted basic rights, the ability to elevate themselves and provide for their families on their own terms. You had the Hungarian and Székely, in some places, nobility, who were part of the old kingdom of Hungary but found themselves under the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire now. There's a long history there, which involved an Ottoman invasion and the slow destruction of the Kingdom of Hungary. But they had vestiges of privileges and rights. And so, when the emperor, with his Enlightenment ideology of this liberal humanism, decided to say to the ethnic Romanians, well, I have this Ottoman threat who are my civilizational foes in their Islamic imperialism. If you rise up through the ranks and provide me with services along my border as guards, that would benefit me. The aristocracy, well, they didn't want their workers to leave their fields. They were not amused. If you like this content, why not pound the like button or subscribe? To understand how this revolt started, we need to understand the social, ethnic, and legal mix that, in my opinion, made some kind of peasant revolt inevitable. So let's go back, before this, 3.5 centuries. Yes, it's that complex, this Transylvanian mixture of peoples and legal stuff and religions and lordships. And in 1437, the Vlach peasants of Romania, who mostly followed the Orthodox Christian faith, along with Hungarian-speaking Székely, fell out with the Catholic Bishop of Transylvania, who decided to collect taxes in arrears and tithes, going back most of a decade, to please the far-off courts in Budapest and Vienna. This bishop, named Georgi Lepes, made one silly mistake. He decided to also raise taxes on the petty noblemen of the local Hungarian nobility. So when the Vlach peasants, ethnic Romanians, began a revolt, some of these petty noblemen became leaders of this revolt and organized the Vlachs against the Kingdom of Hungary's aristocracy in order to claim their ancient rights as Székely. I don't have time to go into the ancient rights of the Székely, borderland warriors with privileges from the king. Let's leave it at that and carry on. The revolt of 1437 was brutal because the lands had been divided into two kinds of government. Firstly, noble counties who were ruled by feudal landlords who owned serfs, mostly ethnic Romanian Vlachs, but quite a few Hungarians were serfs too, who were forbidden from leaving their lord's lands. Serfs were slaves essentially. And second, autonomous areas called seats, where Székely and Germanic Saxons were allowed to live without feudal lords, with local self-rule under the king. But in truth, these areas were largely outside the law, and held by local Hungarian-speaking warlords, with their own customs, who used Saxons as a merchant class to make them wealthy, whilst holding down the ethnic Romanians as a servant class, tied to the land by law. Oh, and they could not marry without the permission of their local lord? Basically, these noble counties and local seats went to war against each other, though some flipped sides. As usual, the ethnic Romanians caught between suffered. At this time, the Ottoman Empire was expanding up the Danube River. These Székely and Saxons united to defend themselves against Islamic imperialism. They were unable to stand alone against an entire empire, so they sought help from the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, Sigismund of Luxembourg. However, Sigismund was dealing with uprisings in Czech lands. See my video on the Moravian Vlachs who fought Sigismund. So he was not going to bother with ethnic tensions in the south, which could endanger his wars in the north, due to Romanian Vlach population. The revolt of 1437 broke out under the leadership of a Hungarian noble named Antal Nagy de Buda. This is important as he briefly led an army of ethnic Romanians and Székely, peasants, who attacked both the Hungarian aristocracy and the Saxon merchant class. In the end, the peasants were put to siege and wiped out in mass killings as you would expect, but the local aristocracy had been scared by how Székely and ethnic Romanians united against them. So following the revolt of 1437, the Transylvanian aristocracy formed an alliance, a settlement with Saxon merchants and Székely, called the Union of the Three Nations. This settlement excluded the ethnic majority Romanians from any status or power. Even when Michael the Brave briefly ruled Transylvania and united Romanian lands in the year 1600, his merely being in a place able to undo the settlement caused a revolt of the Hungarian nobility, which led to his ruin and the end of a united Romania. So by the 1770s, this settlement had lasted in one form or another almost 350 years. But the 1770s were quite a decade. This was the age of Enlightenment revolution. The American colonies began a war against the world's greatest empire after drafting a document using Enlightenment ideas. The Greeks under Orlov aligned with Catherine the Great and rose up in armed though failed revolution against the Ottoman Empire, but they began to think of themselves in the terms of a modern nation state, which was a new idea of the Enlightenment. The Polish revolted. In France, Jacques Rousseau published Du Contrat Social, which ignited debates about the will of the people and the legitimacy of rulers across Europe. And so by 1784, when the enlightened despot Joseph II decided to make reforms for the good of the people of Transylvania, the local aristocracy was not amused by this. If I had just jumped into the revolt without going through all of that, you might have both been confused and thought this was just about Romania without any context of an ethnic Romanian nation beginning to assert itself in a changing Europe, in which, for the first time, because of these Enlightenment despots actually, the peasants working the land were beginning to be able to read, which gave them the ability to mobilize and, in some positions, some places, gain power, as you saw actually in Ukraine. That's another video. But in this case, Horea knew how to read, which was very rare for Transylvanian peasants. And so he was put in charge of going to the emperor in Vienna to speak on behalf of the serfs. And it looks like he actually convinced Joseph II to free the serfs. Now, I need to mention just a side note about Horea. That name comes from an instrument, a flute-like instrument. I'll put it on the screen now. He built wooden churches, and it appears that during his learning how to do this, he learned how to read and write, which was uncommon for Transylvanian peasants. This man's name was Vasile Ursu Nicola, but Horea for this instrument because he played it. He convinced Joseph II to not, I don't know if we can say help him, but be lenient enough to give leeway so that it was kind of inevitable that some kind of revolt was going to erupt. Was it Horea convincing the Holy Roman Emperor? Or was the Holy Roman Emperor using him to take a roll on the dice? Well, if this peasant revolts, he might kill a few of my courtly enemy rivals in the aristocracy who don't believe in this liberal Enlightenment ideology that was taking hold. I think it was a mixture of both. On the 31st of January 1784, Emperor Joseph II ordered the border guard to be increased. From many villages, men came to Alba Iulia to enlist, as this offered them a better life than being serfs. The local authorities, under a landlord nobility, tried to slow down the process to prevent their mostly ethnic Romanian workers from leaving the fields. Rightly or wrongly, or perhaps in mere confusion, this was seen by many as the nobility trying to stop them from making a better life for their families. Horea himself responded by spreading a rumor that the emperor had made him leader of the Romanians. Whilst further southwest, a man named Crișan called on serfs to revolt around the Fehercuroș River, that's Crișan Alb in Romanian, along the border of Hungary and Romania today. When Horea returned from his final trip to Vienna, at the beginning of summer in 1784, he claimed the emperor had given him a golden diploma, a letter declaring him leader of the Romanian peasants. Whether this is true or not, we will never know. It is a folk tradition in Transylvania today. The emperor may have wanted a revolt to kill the nobility opposed to his religious reforms, spreading tolerance with his Enlightenment ideology, but that does not mean he would help the revolt if it failed. He could not openly attack his nobility unless victory was certain. So he may have used the Romanian peasants by having them revolt. In the start at least, if Horea won, it was good for Joseph. Enemies out of the way. If Horea lost, well, maybe he'll take down a few of his enemies anyway, and he'll be able then to enact his reforms in the name of peace, and the local aristocracy won't be able to do anything about it. This revolt really benefited the emperor more than anyone else, though of course it benefited the ethnic Romanian peasants in the end. But at the time, Emperor Joseph was quite clever. Whether this rumor was true or not, we will never know. What matters is the peasants now believed this Enlightenment absolutist emperor had given them legal right to hunt down and kill the local nobility. It did not take long for this to explode into an open revolt around the Apuseni Mountains over the late summer. As with any revolutionary mood, it degenerated into a witch hunt by the time of the harvest in autumn. On the 31st of October, a man named Crișan gathered rebels at Mesteacan and attacked the nobility. First, nobles were hunted down and houses burned. But then, around the 3rd of November, the rebel march was stopped by a noble-led militia at Curecu. When the noble-led militia tried to arrest the leaders, they fired back, killing the officers, and they ordered the rest of the militia to put on peasant clothing and convert to Orthodox Christianity or die. The local manors were besieged, and the revolting peasants took up pitchforks and long knives on poles, killing many innocent civilians. Around 4,000 were killed, mostly ethnic Hungarians. The burning of mansions continued, as a man nicknamed Cloșca organized the men into an army under Horea. By the second week of November, the nobility realized the emperor in Vienna was strangely silent. Was he on the side of the rebels, or was he on their side? In truth, Emperor Joseph was probably waiting to see which side would win. The leader of the revolt, Horea, may have also sensed this and saw for a moment he had momentum on his side. So on the 11th of November, he issued an order for the nobility to be abolished and their property confiscated. Smells a bit too much like Marxism for me, but Horea was now leading an army of 20,000 men. Not a small achievement. Meanwhile, Emperor Joseph II hated the local nobility, and until now had held back as much as he could from crushing the revolt, perhaps hoping Horea would kill his enemies for him. But when word reached Vienna on the 20th of November that Horea wanted a social revolution to abolish the noble class entirely, Horea was now threatening Joseph, not just his political rivals. He was threatening the institutions of the monarchy and the institutions which the monarchy needed to exist. And so the emperor could no longer allow the revolt to go on. Horea had taken one step too far, and so the emperor sent in the imperial army to crush the revolt. The rebels, however, did have some advantages. They were in the mountains and knew the terrain far better than anyone who would try to come and kill them. On the 27th of November, they actually defeated the imperial army abroad, in the south of the Apuseni Mountains. This was really just a small skirmish. Around 20 imperial soldiers were killed, but it was an impressive victory, nonetheless, for peasants who defeated an empire in battle. It would outlive them as a growing legend in the region. And yet, winter was setting in upon the mountainous terrain, and the rebels lost men and resources during the battle. The empire surrounded the Apuseni Mountains by early December 1784 and left the rebels with no way out. With winter slowly starving them out, Horea told his men on the 14th of December at Campeni to go back home and hide their weapons until the spring, when they would begin the revolt again. Horea and his fellow revolt leader Cloșca fled east into the Ghilau Mountains, which sits on the eastern edge of the Apuseni, and are full of caves and thick forests to hide in. However, some locals betrayed them for a bounty placed on their heads. In January they were captured. The rebel leader Crișan, though, evaded capture for another month with a small band. Emperor Joseph had clearly waited to see which side to back, and so he now had to prevent the nobility from rebelling against him. The local rulers sentenced 37 men to death, but the emperor gave them amnesty instead, and time in prison. He saved their lives. He could not, however, afford to lose any more favor among the nobility without a rebellion, so he gave the order to give the three leaders of the revolt, Horea, Cloșca, and Crișan, the harshest and cruelest of punishments at Alba Iulia. They were to be broken on the wheel, a horrific method of public execution in which the victim's bones are pummeled and broken until they die. Crișan escaped this fate by hanging himself in his cell the night before his execution. Horea and Cloșca were not so fortunate. A slow, painful death followed. If I knew I was going to be broken on the wheel, I would hang myself too. It is an awful death. Once the punishments and last resistance was finished, Emperor Joseph was able to pass reforms in the name of preventing further revolt. This may have been his plan all along. He abolished serfdom in Transylvania in 1785 and ended aristocratic control over peasant marriages, as well as expanded grazing rights for peasants. So in a way, Horea's revolt was successful. Only a handful of the peasant rebels had died during the uprising. And after the leader's execution, serfdom was abolished. Though serfdom continued in shrinking pockets, the Enlightenment had reached the darkness of the Transylvanian forests and ended the feudal order, paving the way for a rebirth of Romanian nationalism. Horea's revolt reawakened a sense of self in Romanian lands that had almost been lost, and the idea of a Romanian nation began to grow from this point in the hearts of the people.